left off last time, gluing or putting the adhesive around the rear window inside the rear surround in the last video. Now we're going to take that rear surround and we're going to attach it to the Jetta with all of the body panels pre-positioned. So come on in here. First cut, as it says in the manual, and I'm going to say again on the video itself, here's the front door, and we're starting this time with a wagon because the wagon's a little more difficult, so I wanted to show you guys how to do it. We're going 3 1/4 inches from the back edge right here, the top corner of the front door. There's the front door, top corner. You're going to measure 3.25 inches out, and you're going to make a mark. And you're going to go all the way across. This particular car is a sunroof car, and you can see where the cut is around 2 inches behind the sunroof. Don't use the sunroof as a guide. Use the door as the guide. And we've talked about this before. It's in the manual, but I just wanted to reinforce this area. I wanted to re-emphasize this area of the car and where you cut. So 3 1/4 inches from the front door. Take a look here. You've got two things I want to talk about. One is this is a sunroof car, so you're going to have to seal off this area of the sunroof. This is a drain. Water is designed to actually go through the sunroof, collect in a drain, and dump into these channels. So you're going to want to put silicone, zoom in here if you can, you're going to want to fill all of this with silicone, and I'm going to do that to this car. So don't worry about this inside area here, but you're going to, all these little channels and grooves, you want to make sure you put the GE silicone 2 in those grooves and raise to this wall here, this 1/2 inch, have it come straight across. So you're going to seal this off with a dam so the water only drains through the front of the sunroof. You guys know my choice is to seal off the sunroof completely using a wrap or a small piece of rubber tape, something on the outside. But if you choose to use the tilt function, you're going to have to seal this off. The other thing, leave the headliner 1.5 inches beyond your cut. This is your heavy cut, 3 1/4 inches behind the door, right here. Leave 1.5 inches of headliner sticking out, and leave 2.5 inches of the headliner fabric. See this here? This is that headliner fabric. So leave 1.5 inches of the hard board, leave 2.5 inches of the fabric, and that's so that you can wrap the fabric around the hard board and have a nice clean installation of the rear surround, which we're going to talk about after we mount the quarters. So now that we have the rear area, the roof of the car trimmed and cleaned up, we're ready to start positioning the fiberglass pieces that come with the car. So come on over here, Tim. This area here always is a little bit confusing. You're going to want to trim. I'm going to show you. This is a rough fit panel right now, but I'll show you where to trim. You'll see I have a sheet metal screw just holding it in place. This piece right here, you're going to trim this edge on your body flat. You don't want any edge sticking down. This piece is designed to mount flat to the aluminum. And you can see in the mold, you'll see these little lines are kind of indented in the mold. This is what you're going to want to see, because you're going to seal off this to the weather. So you're not going to want to have any road noise or anything from the outside getting into the cabin. So you're going to seal off with silicone this seam right here before you mount the rear surround. So this trimming here, you can see I kind of, I'll fit it, I'll take it off, I'll fit it again, and then at the very end, when I like the door gaps and everything else, then I'll do all the sealing at the very end. So this is the trim line for the top of the rear quarter panel. This is how much I leave on the front edge. You can see on the Mark IV, you've got a step here. I leave about 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch. It's your choice. This is rough trimmed as you get the piece in the crate. I'm actually going to sand this down, with a sander to get a nice clean edge here. Inside here, I did mount the inner fascia plate. So this aluminum plate that is your visual barrier, I mounted this so that I could shim this body out and in as we're doing a rough fitting. So if I need this area of the body to go out 1/8 of an inch or so, I'll actually stuff a little piece of wood or something between the fascia and the body, just hand fit it, to see if I can get all the gaps perfect before drilling all the holes. The lower part here, you'll know where to fit. Let me close the door. So down here, you're going to want to get this gap, this line right here, this detail, you're going to want to get that fairly close to this opening. On one side of the car, this wants to ride a little bit high. And so I think it's the driver's side. The passenger side fits perfect. As the molds came out, for whatever reason, the driver's side, this one is about 1/8 of an inch higher. And I leave it high because when you put the second piece of the lower sill on here, it kind of disappears anyway. So I use this mounted to the very top of this gap on both sides. And then watch this gap here. Remember, we're pre-fitting the panel. Make sure this corner of your door roughly lines up with this corner of the body. This is where I start. I do the front edge first. Get the gap where you want it. You can move this in and out. Remember, I have a sheet metal screw up here. I put another sheet metal screw in down here because underneath here we have steel of the original Jetta. As you go to the rear, use clamps. Fit your tailgate. Remember, this tailgate, all I did was put the hinge on the tailgate here, mounted and bolted everything up, and we've seen this in the other videos on the aluminum bed and how you bolt it together. I rough fit the tailgate here, and here's what I'm checking. Check this. You're going to want to get your gaps about 3/16 per side at the top of the tailgate. The bottom is adjustable. We don't worry too much. Take a look under here. You can see where the tailgate has about a 1/4 inch gap. This is your roll pan. You can temporarily, this is not even mounted yet. I just set the roll pan behind this panel. You can see where I have not trimmed this all the way. This says flashing still from the mold. So I'm going to remove another 1/8 of an inch off of this panel to fit it really nicely on the roll pan. And if you have these pieces in front of you, it's a lot easier to see. You can see where I just clamp the body in place. Once again, when the front gap is done by the door, the rest of this follows. This particular build being one of the first cars we did, this little tailgate piece is sticking to the rear about 1/8 of an inch too far. So I'm actually going to oval out one of those holes for the lower hinge and move the tailgate forward at the bottom about 1/8 of an inch. The later cars, you won't have to do that. I think it was already taken care of in cars after number 150. This being an earlier one, I have to modify it a little. And that's it. So when you pre-fit all of these pieces, you should get, remember, I have a little screw here. I might put a little temporary sheet metal screw right in here to hold the roll pan together. All you're looking for in the early stages are gaps. You want to get the door gap nice. You want to get the tailgate gap. You want to get the roll pan gap to the tailgate lower. All of those gaps you want to get right when it's in rough fiberglass. The next stage, after it's rough fitting this, the next stage is going to be putting in your rear surround that you placed your rear window in. The first step after you put the window, you guys saw how we put the window in with the weights and we held it in. We have the windshield adhesive. The drains are open on the bottom. We do that when the rear surround is pretty rough. I like to do a lot of the body work. This particular car is an older car that had the rear quarter windows in the rear surround. So I actually filled the quarter windows because we're doing a video on a modern Smith Ute build. The modern cars that we're shipping now, the ones from the last year and a half, do not have the quarter window. And so I filled in, you can see where the quarter window used to be. I filled in the quarter window on this older car. If you have an older car with a quarter window, there's a little recess here and there's a plexi window that fits in here. Same exact shape otherwise, but the quarter window is no longer there. So you start, and I'm starting with the same piece you would at home. I do a lot of the trimming and the body work before installing this on the car, the rear surround. There's two tips. One is the difference between the wagons and the sedans are very slight, but they are there. When I do a wagon, I really do make a slit. Remember, this gap, and I'll show you on the car, this gap here is a rubber gasket between the door and the roof. I continue this line, this 1/2 inch line here, I continue it down and all the way to the window on the rear surround. And the reason I do that is that under this gap here, I can make a slit in the rear surround, and I cut the rear surround all the way down toward the window, and then that allows the sides to flex and move, and then I can easily fill that and then cover it with the rubber or the urethane windshield adhesive. So the next step, after showing you where we trim, and these are the trim parts, you can zoom in here, Tim, if you'd like. I have two, you see this is the flange right here that goes under the steel. This is the flange, this is the edge where that rubber strip will be. You can see where we trim the sides, and I'm doing the body work here, so you can see it. See how I recess this a little bit so that it slides easier. This is the side where I'm doing the body work. I mean, you can see where I've got about a 1/2 inch notch. This is in the mold. You'll see this notch in the mold. Just trim it out, remove a little off the top here, and then we can test fit this piece. Even though I'm doing body work on this to make sure everything is nice and perfect, you can see how it fits onto the car. So this is the rear of the steel that's cut. And you can see there's two layers. There's a thicker layer underneath and a thin layer on top that moves. This whole thing is very flexible without the structure of the rear surround. So the way to put the rear surround in, is to slide one side, tilt that up there. We're gonna slide one side. So we're gonna put Timmy's side, he's gonna put the corner between the two layers. I'm gonna move, and it's a two-man job. I'm gonna go up and down to line it up. So go ahead and put his corner is about 1/4 of an inch in right now. I'm gonna look at the gap and I'm gonna raise while he pushes. You got that side. And then it goes along the middle here as it comes over. And then on this side, I'll have to push this down a little. And I'm pushing on the flange to get it to slide. Yours in there. So that slides in. And now you can take the camera and show how this is in place. I just wanted to show you. So this is where I'm doing the work. And there's two ways to do this. See how the rubber, the old rubber seal, is actually under the fiberglass? I'm lately cutting this rubber right here. And the reason I'm doing that is so I don't get leaks. I've noticed that if I have the rubber seal in here and I'm using silicone, the silicone can break away from the rubber and you have to reseal it with the black, the black line is going to go all the way over the top, right? So this thick line here, you can trim this fiberglass piece to the width up here. So I trim this right along that edge. And when you do that, you get a more consistent stripe that goes all the way down to the back. And then I think I've been using the black windshield adhesive from this point all the way down and around. And I think that's a better way to do it. You're gonna grind and fill this part to seal off the edge. You can use panel bond, between the two. Just make sure you grind the bottom of this metal to bare metal. Make sure this is bare metal underneath if you're using panel bond, right? Bare fiberglass, bare metal, you can bond it together and you probably don't even have to use the rivets, the flush rivets to hold it. But this corner seems to be an issue that we talk about. If you're gonna trim it, trim it so that you have a full 1/2 inch. And remember, that's why we do this in a rough state. And then I take this line right here and I continue it down, and this is black, right? So I compare, trim this away, trim that away, and then keep a consistent line. I've been removing that rubber from underneath, trim it, and then use windshield adhesive to go all the way to the corner. So that's how I do it. There's 5 different ways to do it. Once this gap is good, if you'll follow, this is very flexible. Remember, once the rear surround is on, this moves in and out. Get your gap right. And then when you get your gap right, use a hole right here and a hole right here in the gutter. Screw it to the B-pillar and then put your windshield adhesive all along this gap on the inside. So get your gap right to the door, mount it with a little screw. And remember, the screw stays there even though it's invisible at the end, but it pulls it. The screw does this. You have a screw here. You can just turn the screw and you're going to adjust this in and out, right? So when you get it at the right gap, freeze it with your little, with a sheet metal screw, put your windshield adhesive in here, and your windshield adhesive will cause your wind noise and your gap to be filled. Leave the screw in place, and then when you paint the car, all of that will be covered. The last thing I do on body fit concerns the fuel cap and the rear lights. On the fuel cap, if you look at the mold really carefully, and some of the early molds don't have this, you can zoom in here. There's a line in the mold that I did the blue line to shadow the mold lines that are in here. But basically, you're going to be mounting your fuel cap assembly. This is your fuel door. You're going to be mounting this fuel cap assembly in this fiberglass body because the steel body is cut away underneath, correct? I use a screw right here, and so I leave these pads here, and I leave about 3/16, a quarter inch of material all around. I leave this. The dots are glass that I leave, right? Because we need a shoulder for this to mount on, right? So I mount this with 2 screws. The one I want to tell you about is this bulbous hinge area for the gas cap goes under, and if you look on your original Jetta, you'll see a little step. A little step just like this. It's in the mold. So after you trim, this is going away, right? After you trim this out, you're going to want to thin this area, right? This area that I have in blue here, where these dots are, that area you're going to want to grind from the back side to get it about 1/16 of an inch thick. And that's because if you look at the side of your gas cap, this gas cap has to slide into that groove before it can go in place. So you're going to want to grind away. See how that's about 1/16 of an inch thick? This has to be very thin underneath. Not this body outside, just that little flange there has to slide in that little gap. And so that gives people fits if they don't do it. They try to jam this in there. It's not going to go. It has to slide inside. Remember, this is plastic. If you take, you can keep looking at that. If you take a Sawzall blade that you used to cut your car and you just open up the gap with a Sawzall blade just like that, that'll do the same thing. Plastic is really easy to cut. This is really easy to sand. It's your choice. Just don't sand this down so thin that the gap disappears, the flange disappears. The other thing you're going to want to look at is the rear taillights. The taillights have prongs that slide into these areas. You can see them very clearly in the mold, but this little square here, this little rectangle, is the original Ford Explorer Sport Track. You'll see them in the mold very clearly. There's like a little imprint. So what I X'd out there, those are the areas where the tab slides in. And what I wanted to tell you about is this surface right here, where I'm going to put the dots. So this flat surface right here, beyond the cutout. So there's your little rectangular cutout. This surface right here, sometimes when they mold the cars, you'll see that can get kind of thick. So after you cut away this piece, see what the thickness is of this panel. On the Explorer, this was about 1/8 of an inch thick. This wall and this wall here was about 1/8 of an inch, maybe 0.1 thick. So just make sure, if you find it's a 1/4 inch thick, because the molder happened to put a lot of fiberglass there, you're going to want to grind this surface from the back side. You're going to want to grind it down. Remember, 1/8 of an inch thick is about the thickness of that dot. So you're going to want this leading edge right here. If I'm looking at it, pretend the marker is your eyeball. You're going to look at it from the rear, and you're going to want this edge to be no more than 1/8 of an inch thick, which is about the thickness of that line. So when you're looking at it this way, you want to see an edge. I painted it horizontal there. You're going to want to see this edge look like that. 1/8 of an inch thick, looking that way, top and bottom. And then you're going to do your hole saw here for your tail light, your lenses. You'll see, hold the light on there, you'll see right where to drill your hole saw. That's pretty easy. The one other thing I want to show you is when you go to position the body, this is pretty much, see how you have to notch out the body so that it can go a little bit beyond the aluminum. And remember, this is one of the early cars, so I'm showing you pretty much the worst of the worst, and it's not that bad. I had to notch this out to make this move a little bit towards the center. that's all the little tips I have. Make sure, remember on this particular car, I didn't trim enough away, so I'm going to be trimming on the real line. If I look at the mold, that's the real line that I should have trimmed. And you can see it in the mold. You know, so I need to take almost a 1/4 inch off of this, which is going to go all the way up to this line, even with the aluminum. And then this roll pan flange slides under that, and you're going to rivet, you know, flush rivets right there to bind the whole thing together.